Hello everyone, welcome back to our Spring Boot series. Continue on the subject about the scopes. Today I would like to introduce the prototype. Okay, so let's see the details. What is scope in Spring? Again, just as a recap, Spring Beans can have different life cycles depending on their scope. And this is the word here, life cycle. And the bean scope determines how many instances exist in an application and how long. That's the two things related with the scope, is how many exist and how long. For instance, how many, if you are using a singleton, which is the discussion in my previous video, you only have one instance. But for instance, this one that we'll be talking about, the prototype, you can have more than one. And how long, for instance, there are specific scopes like this one, request, session, or application, that is determined by the how long, because for instance the request, it's a bean that exists during an HTTP request in your web application, and the session, it's as long as your session is active, for instance, and the application, it's your website. But I will talk more deeply about these three in future video. Today I like to talk this prototype, which is a new instance every time it's requested. Okay. Singleton scope, it's a subject that I addressed in my previous video. Again, use the singleton pattern, means that you only have one instance during all the lifetime of your application. The instance is cached and reused whenever it is requested, and it's great for stateless services. You don't want to use stateful beans with the singleton, otherwise you have to handle all the thread and concurrency things that can happen in the data inside the singleton. Okay, to define it, you just use the component. By default, every bean in Spring are singleton. The prototype scope, what it is, which is the subject of this video, every time the bean is requested, Spring creates a new instance. Every time I repeat is requested, a new instance is created. Spring only handles initialization and DI, because it just creates, gives to you, but it doesn't cache them, because it doesn't need to cache these beans, because they will never be reused in the future. So there is no reason to manage the whole life cycle, meaning I introduced this in my previous video, but when you create a bean or ask for a bean, you can add specific methods, specific annotations that you want to be called as callbacks after, for instance, a bean is created and before it's destroyed. But for the prototype scope, Spring Boot doesn't care about when this instance disappears, like it is collected by the garbage collector, for instance. So it doesn't handle the life cycle, because it knows that it will never be used a second time by any other bean. So you inject it, just use it one time. That's it. If you request again one of these beans, it will create a new instance. So there is no reason to manage the end part of the life cycle. So it does not manage the full life cycle. Only the initialization, because he has to create one, but he never knows when it will be destroyed, and it doesn't care. It will not cache these bits. It will be on the responsibility of the developer after he receives the bin to do whatever you want with it. Okay, the way to define, we just add the word scope prototype, and again it's used for short-lived, stateful, and non-thread saved objects. That's the purpose of these prototypes. So why use prototype scope? You want fresh state with each use. Meaning, for instance, you want to generate a GUID or something, or information that you need for a specific point in a cycle, or you want to run a specific thread, or start 100 threads that they should do something, but each thread should have a component isolated for the others, but it's the same component. So you want, in that case, the prototype, you'll need 100 instances for a while. So the prototype, it's a use case to use. Running multi-threaded tasks, avoid race conditions, stateful class, generate unique IDs, timestamps, or job tokens, and things like that. They are quite nice use cases for the prototype. In visual comparison, if you want to check the singleton or prototype, if you are more a visual person, so if there is a client that calls the get bin for a specific bin, if it's a singleton, it will always receive the same. But if you have a specific bin and you call get bin 3 times, you will have 3 different instances of the prototype bin. Drawbacks of prototype scope can be memory intensive. Yeah, if you start to abuse them. If it's a single application, maybe you don't care about this, but if you are in a website with thousands of users or requests per minute and you abuse on the use of the prototypes, just do some multiplication. Imagine that you have 1,000 requests and you create in each one, let's say, one prototype or two prototypes. It's quite easy to start the multiplier and check how many prototypes will be created. Or imagine that in one request you have to generate or execute 10 somethings with 10 prototypes. You have 1,000, then you have 10,000 of these objects in memory. It's not that even if they don't take too much memory, the garbage collector have to handle thousands of things, and this can take a while. Sometimes people don't understand it. Sometimes it's not the quantity of the memory. It's better to have one object that takes 4 gigabytes of memory than having 4 million objects taking the same space when you sum all that up, because you have to handle all of them. That's the problem. So can be more memory intensive if used frequently. Spring does not manage destruction. You must manually handle cleanup if necessary. Not optimal for expensive initialization. Spring does not manage destruction. It doesn't mean that you have to destroy the object. The garbage collector will clean after it's used, but it doesn't handle if you want to clean something on that object. That's the thing. Meaning that the Spring doesn't keep it inside, let's say, the instance inside cached like the Singleton, because he understands it's not necessary. So it doesn't manage the destruction because it's not even there. Okay, let's see some real world examples. Like imagine you want to generate a report, and each report job needs its own isolated generated. Imagine that we have a random GUID like or universal identification and all other data, and it's a good use for prototyping, meaning that you have a request, you want to generate a specific report, specific parameters with a very specific ID for a specific customer, for a specific set of data, and that's a good point for the prototype. So we just get this component and you call the generate. Of course, you need probably to provide some information here on the parameter generate, but so you understand. But this one, it will generate this will always be unique, because every time you request one of these components to the Spring Bean, it will create an instance of this one, which means that this code will be executed, so this ID will always be different, meaning when you'll generate, you'll have always different data, and you don't even have to create a constructor or do some initialization. Everything is done by the Spring. It's one of the advantages to use the components and beans in Spring. Of course, there are some disadvantages of this, because in the code, you just get the bin, you are not controlling the instantiation, but you can add some control if you want with lifecycle. If you create a method with a notation called post-construct, maybe you can initialize something. Okay, it's very useful, this type of prototypes in a multi-thread, job runners or batch jobs and things like that, because they only exist for that time. After that, they will be destroyed. Using prototype bin directly, let's say we have a REST controller, we can inject something, and I will go deep this in a future video called application context. For now, let's say that application context is where all the bins exist, all the bins that you define. Okay, represents the application, again, context, the context where the application is being executed. And then you have this method run that which is called when you do an HTTP request to this address. And then this is one way to get the bin. You can inject the bin. It's not a good idea to inject prototypes, but you can. But in this case, since you want a new instance, every time there is one of these bins it's requested, it's not a web request. The request here implicit, it is this line, context.getBin, and we provide here the class of the bin, and Spring Boot will go internally to the bin's registration, checks, okay, do I have any bin of this type? I have, it's a prototype, I'll create a new instance and return here, and I will generate the report and return a done, meaning, okay, I'll generate the report. Meaning if I have 1,000 web requests here, 1,000 of these bins will be created because of this get bin. This get bin using the application context will take into consideration the definitions of the bin. In our case, they will be prototypes. So, and again, if it's a prototype, remember when the bin is requested, Spring creates a new instance. Problem: injecting prototype in Singleton. Is it possible? It is, but be careful. Remember that the singleton is created when the Spring Boot initializes. And if you inject like this report generator, which is a prototype here, it will be injected one instance because there will be one request to this bin. But that's it. Since this one it's a singleton, even if I use this generator 10 times, it will be the first one created. It will act somehow after injected as a singleton, because it will be just a value, that an instance that will be set here on this singleton. So this one will only be called once for this component. The only way, if you want more, is to use something like this. There are other ways with proxy and singleton, quite advanced, that I will address again in the future. I address in the singleton. You can check my explanation about proxies when you inject, let's say, more refined scopes inside the singleton. Here you can apply the same thing, but usually it's not a good idea unless you have a real reason to inject a report generator here. Okay, unless this is stateless. But if it's stateless, there is no reason to be a prototype. Maybe it should be a singleton report generator. So always think about, okay, this one is prototype, this is singleton. Should this one be prototype? Maybe I'm not defining it correctly. Do I really need it to be prototype? Is there something unique in each request for this bin? No, so it's a singleton. Now there is something unique, it's always different. Okay, maybe it should be prototype, but maybe I don't want to inject it. Maybe I want this approach when I'm generating the report. Okay, just think, there is no universal solution. I always give tools to think, because at the end of the day, our job is to choose the right tools and fit for the right solutions. So I just explain the different two ways to get the bins from Spring Boot. One is the ObjectFactory. It's a lazy bin provider. Lazily provides a bin instance when needed. It's quite easy to get an object. You can see here that you have this ObjectFactory. The Spring Boot knows about ObjectFactory and asks us to put here the data type of this factory, meaning it creates a factor for this bin. Okay, it's not the same as ApplicationContext that contains all the bins. This one is specific for this one, and we can auto error as much as we can. So we have here a report generated factory, meaning that I write report generated factory get object, and you can compare with this one, with this get bin, and we provide here which bin do we want. Here, no, it's a factory that was created specifically for these bins. So when we get the object, it will provide me an instance of this bin. If it's necessary, if this bin is a prototype, if it's a singleton, of course, it will return the same instance. But that's one of the difference between ObjectFactory and the application context that I address here again into more detail. But at the end of the day, the application context is the full Spring container. It's the main interface for accessing Spring Boot's infrastructure. Meaning your application starts, the application context is created with every bin that it's possible to collect at the start of the application. So retrieves any bin, singleton or prototype, provides full capabilities, even publishing, resource loading, and so on, things that I will address in the future. And you can inject like this one, and here you have more, let's say, versatility to get bins, because you are just saying, go to the context and find a bin of this type, and you can use any one here. And again, it's different from this one. Here you don't choose one, it's the factory that generates. This factory only generates this type of bins. So a small comparison between both. So the main role ObjectFactory, it's a lazy bin instantiation. It only creates when it really is necessary. The application context, full container, and context manager. The singletons are already there created. The other ones can be or not depending on the scope. This is the full data of the application regarding the bins. This one is just a factory that understands how to create instances when necessary. So typical use, prototype or request scoped bins. It's bins that we need on demand. Application context, any bin. We can use application context to get any bin. It's lightweight, yes, it is. It is not lightweight, everything is in there, so it's an heavy class. Access all bins, not just one type, as you can see here. The one that we defined for this ObjectFactory. Okay, the application context, of course, it's the application context. You can access any bin. Extra features, no. Application context contains all the features other than the bins, like events, resource, internationalization and things like that. Correct way using ObjectFactory, how to use it. It's the same example that I showed before. So you inject here using AutoWire, and you Spring Boot will create here a factory, and you get the object like this. So you have a report generator. It can handle it because this is a generic type, and generic type it's the same as this one here. Another way to do it is using JavaX index provider. This is a standard, and Spring Boot supports the standard. I didn't introduce yet this, but usually rather than use AutoWire, you can use, for instance, inject. There are other annotations that you can use that are standard in Java Enterprise, not Spring Boot, and Spring Boot supports it. Usually people use AutoWire because it's very Spring Boot, but you can replace with for instance, the annotation that exists in this JavaX inject. And one of the ways for this standard to get instances using a provider, let's call this provider, it's very similar to this one, to the factory, but it's standard, it's not Spring Boot, it's standard Java Enterprise, but the concept is the same. You have a provider, report generator, and here you use get, here you use get object, but the purpose, it's the same. Then another way is using the application context, get bin here, and here we provide the type of the bin as we saw earlier. So comparison table in between the singleton and the prototype. Instance count, singleton 1, prototype multiple, memory low, just one instance, high depending on the number of instance. Lifecycle manager, yes, prototype only need, because if it is, there is no reason to cache these objects. Trade safety required, optional depending on the code, of course. Use case, stateless. Prototype, it's commonly used for stateful temporary. That's why I choose prototype, because for sure it will have a state specific for a task that it's that was the origin for or the reason to use the prototype. So where can we use it? We can use it in configuration classes like this one, and we can use the scope also here to define this bin. And again, this is a different way to create the bin. Other than using the components. So we have programmatic control. You can do a lot of things here before returning the instance. It's more flexible and it's easier for complex bins. When some complexity, meaning that to create these, maybe we have to go to a database, get some data, do a lot of stuff, and then we create a report generator, for instance. That's one approach. Otherwise, you can just use the component and not use the configuration class. Meaning this one, you can also using this approach, component scope. This is, of course, it's simpler, because it is as is. We don't, the Spring Boot will create, it will call the constructor of this class. And here it is not, the Spring Boot is not calling the constructor of the class, it's just calling this method, and we can do whatever we want, and it will be on our side to call the constructor of the class. So this one is better for simple bins, this one for complex bins. I mean, you want to use configuration bin when something is complex to initialize. You want to use the component when it's simple to initialize. Okay. Bin component, prototype scope. Let's see some comparisons here. So flexibility, you have more flexibility when you use configuration class. When you use component, it's lower. Type of bin, programmatic bin, ideal for advanced setup. When you use the configuration class, meaning when you are using this one here, these are automatically managed by Spring at the start of your application, or even when you use the application context to get the bin, it's the same thing. Usage scope, complex bins requiring explicit control, simpler bin, just a constructor, like we said in our previous slides. Scanner requirement, no need for component scanning. Requires component scanning to locate component class. Meaning the scanning, it's the activity that is performed when the Spring Boot application initializes. It will tries to find all the components. Here, this one only find is, of course, the configuration class will also be scanned, for at least for the configuration class, but the bins will be addressed later. So best practices: use Singleton for stateless services, reusable, prototype for short-lived tasks. Remember that it occupies a lot of memory. Job-specific processing, bins requiring fresh state in each use. Some caution, expensive unit in prototype. Be careful in the constructor of a prototype, because if you will have a lot of them, you should be careful, because if you imagine that it takes a while in the constructor, it goes to a database, opens a file or something, and if you use a lot of them, it will the time that it takes to create one, multiply it by several of them, maybe your application can start to be slow. So be careful when we use the prototype, and check what are you doing on the constructor and how many instances you will need. Okay, so frequent creation, performance issues. Okay, so real integration, for instance, job executor. This is a nice example to use one of the prototype. We are using here the ObjectFactory again, and you can see that with a simple code, like I'm starting 5 threads and I'm getting this bin like this, meaning a report generator like this. I have a thread that should execute the generate from this bin here and start the thread. It's quite simple when you have this. You don't have to create instance here, nothing. You just have the bin and you just start, and you have 5 of them. This is not a very use case for Singleton. It will be very strange to use the same bin starting for multiple threading. It's possible, but it's quite strange. Why do I need so many threads to use the same bin? Probably I will learn something different here and put the threads probably inside the bin and inject probably executor. If you study more about the threading tools that Spring Boot provides, and even Java Enterprise provides, you can see maybe you want to switch the approach if this bin was a singleton. But in prototype, it's quite simple, and it's a very good use case. So in summary, scope prototype gives you a fresh bin every time. Great for task-based logic. Avoid injecting prototypes directly into singletons. They are too compatible. You can do it, but it's strange. You decide that you have one bin that should be created every time there is a request, combined with a bin that it's only created once. Okay, be careful with that. Use provider, ObjectFactory, or ApplicationContext. There are 3 ways to get bins. Not only prototype, you can use these to other types of bins, but in prototype it makes complete sense to use them. And be aware of memory performance trade-offs when your code requires a lot of these prototype bins. So thank you to assist on this presentation. I will show you in a moment the code. So we will do some code walkthrough and see some examples of the usage of the prototypes. So in a moment. So we have here our application, and I've added a few things. First, I added a table called password reset tokens. Sometimes we need to reset a password and we want to generate a specific token for a specific user by email, for instance, or by username, and we send the token to email and say, okay, click here, and there is a token generated. It's unique, and this token usually only exists for, let's say, 15 minutes or something like that. That's the time that you need to change your password. And it's a quite nice use case to use the prototype. So I create this table to keep the tokens here, which is an ID, and auto increment the token that will be generated, user email, which will be the destinatory of the token, and of course the expiration date. And now I've created here a REST controller on the users. It's already created, but I added 2 methods. One is just to list the password tokens, just for us to see it. Usually you don't need this one because all the tokens will be in a table, but for educational purpose, we want to see that it was created. This is the important one. So for a user, I want to reset the password. Okay, and I will provide a JSON like an email, for instance, or a username like this. And I'm using map because I don't want to create a specific class just for one attribute, and you can use a map, and the Spring Boot understands when you provide a JSON, if you put a map here, it will inject here the name of the property and here the value of the property. So in this case, it will call the user service reset password with a JSON property called username, and this one will be called for the user service. It will generate one of those tokens, and I will get the token, and I will respond to the REST API the token that was generated. So here, and you can see on the reset password, we are returning a password reset token. I'll show you in a moment what it is. And I'll go to the database, get the user here, and then I have a password services that will be here that will generate the token for this user. So there is this user, I'll provide the user, and it will generate the token. So the token is generated again, which will be a password reset token. The password reset token is just a class representing this schema. So this is our token, username, and expiry. Of course, it's a good practice to have a class to represent that. So you have the token here, the expiration, and the email of the user. Okay, and you can see here that it's a component. Okay, and this is the scope prototype. And here you can see that when we create this reset token, we generate the token and the expiration automatically. So these two will, so every time this constructor is called, and it will be called by Spring, not by us, okay, because it's a component, so we can ask him to just get this an instance of this one, it will call this, and then later we assign this to email. We cannot assign here because it's by injection. Remember that if you are using components, the constructor will be called by injection, and we don't have an email to provide here to be injected. So it was possible, but it will be very complicated. So there is no reason to complicate the code. So we just ask for this instance, we set an email, and that's it. It's a kind of a POJO here. So let's return to our service. Then we have our REST controller. Again, that will calls the reset password. The reset password receives a username, goes to database, get all the information about the user, and now it calls the password services to generate the token. This password services, it's here injected. It's just a common services business that understands how to generate the tokens. And this password service, it's, where did I put it? It's under the services. Okay, it's services here. Password service, it's here. So in the password service, you can see that I injected here the ObjectFactory for the password reset token because I want to create. This is our component, the reset token, and now I need a factory so I can create instance of this. Remember this service, it's a singleton. So I'm injecting this factory and the users repository here. And now when the service is created, of course, I'm injecting this factory and the user repository. And now this is generate token that we are calling here. So when the user calls the reset password and the password is called, I say go to the password service and say generate the token. And generate the token receives the user here that was collected from the database. And I'm just getting the object using the factory. I'm not creating an instance of this password reset token, again, because it's the scope is prototype. So we have here the token, and then we assign to user, which is just a method to, after this token was created, so Spring Boot called this constructor, and I'm just setting, okay, just take that prototype instance and set with this email. So assign to this email and save it on the database, meaning on our, in this table. So let's recap this. It seems confused because it's a lot of things happening. So the user calls reset password and we call the reset password for our service because it's a business. We get the user and we use another service called password to generate the token. And we pass the user and it will return a password reset token. So this service, it's its responsibility, this password token, to generate services around passwords. To generate passwords, I'd say it's a singleton, it's a service, a common service. And I say, okay, sometimes I need to create the reset token. So I create the ObjectFactory and I create this object, which is our prototype. And the prototype will contain the token, expression, and email. So, and user repository because I want to save to the database every time I generate one. And in this case, okay, so this is a constructor, which is injection. You can put here auto-wire. It's not mandatory again, because if you only have one constructor, it will be the one that will be called by Spring Boot. So it's optional the use of the auto-wire here, but it's implicit. And now this is generate token that is generated, as I explained. I'm using the factory for as I explained earlier. Here that was injected here. And we have here our prototype assigned to this user, and save to the database. And at this time, we are ready to return the token to our REST controller. And our REST controller, of course, returns the token, which is the string, but in the database, the token was saved, the user mail, and the expiration. So let's see this in practice. I think I explained this 3 times, and sometimes when you explain too much, it gets more complicated than just executed and showing. So the application started. Now I use it here, this way to do calls. Usually I use Postman, but since I'm using IntelliJ, I like to see or to control everything on the call so I can explain better what's happening. So first, let's see which password tokens exist in our table, which is in this address, which is handled here on this REST control. The users, these password tokens, the only thing that does is get password tokens. That calls the user repository get password tokens, just a select that returns the string concatenated with the token, user email, and the expiration. I didn't want to create just a class for this, at least at this time. I just want to show the output in a simple way. So it returns a string and a list of strings. Like this is just the ABC template. I provided several videos about the ABC template. At this time, you should know how to work with them. If you don't, check my previous videos. So let's execute this. So we have this here. We do the play, and you can see it's 200 and empty because you didn't create anyone. So now I am doing a post to create a password token. It's the one that we are discussing in our REST controller. This one, it will receive this map, and this is username that will be extracted. That you can see here, it is username. You can put as many as properties you want here. This map will collect all of them, and then this will follow the thing that I probably explained 2 or 3 times. So let's execute this. And okay, you can see here the token generated. So let's execute again the password tokens to check if it's on the database. Yes, it is. You can see here the concatenation. This is the token that was returned for this user, which is his username here. And the expiration time, you can see here the time of the expiration in 15 minutes. That's the time that was used for the expiration time. And it was here when the prototype is created by Spring Boot. You can see this is the token generated, and here you can see the plus minutes 15 for the local date time. Okay, and here if you execute, you can see the users that exist and our user, it's here. So this is one way to use the prototype. The prototype here again was this password reset token, because it's an instance that will exist just for a short time period, just milliseconds. It will be used only by this password service token factory assigned to user, saved to the database, then returns the token to our REST controller, and the REST controller gets the token string here and returns, and you can see on the output, right, like on this one again, we have this, and again, you can see now we have 2 different tokens generated. So this is one of the use cases to use this kind of prototypes. I know I talk a lot about this. Maybe I could explain this with half of the words, but if you are following my videos, you know I really talk too much. I really like to explain all details, provide use case. I want to make sure that you understand the paradigm, the logic, the semantic that is behind this, because it's more important. It's more important for you to understand how to use it and the wise existence than just to check some examples. For examples, you can search Google and ask, okay, show me examples of use the prototype, but I really like to explain when it should be used and what is the difference between this one and the other ones, because good choices on your application, it's increase the probability of high success on your solution. So thank you for watching. I hope to see you in my next video.